Triple MiG. That's what the radio call said according to the mission transcript from May 18, 1953. Not 3 MiGs or multiple contacts. Triple MiG, two words that appear exactly once in declassified 5th Air Force communications logs, and nobody wrote down what it meant or why that phrasing got used that morning over the Yalu River. The F-86 Sabre that flew that mission sits in a climate-controlled warehouse south of March Air Reserve Base in California. Not on display, just stored. The Air Force Museum Foundation acquired it in 1998 from a private collector who'd bought it as surplus in 1972. Bureau number 51-2753. Natural metal finish, mostly stripped during decades of civilian ownership, then partially restored using photographs from 1953. 14 red stars painted below the left canopy rail, each star roughly 8 inches diameter, hand-painted. The restoration team matched the paint to samples from period-correct aircraft. Nobody visits it. The warehouse isn't open to the public. Occasionally, researchers get access if they file the right paperwork and explain their project sufficiently. I stood next to it for 40 minutes in 2019, trying to photograph the stars clearly, but the lighting was terrible, and my camera kept focusing on the fuselage rivets instead of the paint. The placard, there isn't one yet, they're still cataloging, would say, Joseph McConnell flew this aircraft. Would say 14 confirmed victories. Would say America's top-scoring ace of the Korean War. Probably wouldn't say that nobody's completely certain McConnell flew this specific airframe for all 14 kills because squadron assignments rotated and aircraft got swapped between pilots when maintenance required it, and the victory credit system tracked pilots, not airframes. The stars are there anyway. 14 of them. Someone painted them after the war ended. Maybe the restoration team added them based on McConnell's total count. Maybe they were original and survived the civilian ownership period. The documentation I found doesn't clarify this, and the museum staff I contacted weren't sure either. What's certain, Joseph McConnell shot down 14 MiG-15s between January 14th and May 18th, 1953. That number appears in official Air Force records, victory confirmation documents, and his Medal of Honor citation. The timeline is the part that gets strange. 10 of those kills happened in the final 16 days before the armistice took effect. 4 kills came in one 6-day period, 3 in one day. The concentration suggests either McConnell got extraordinarily lucky during a brief window, or something changed in Chinese Air Force tactics that created opportunities he exploited faster than anyone else. 5th Air Force intelligence summaries from May 1953 note increased MiG activity and aggressive interceptor employment without explaining why Chinese pilots were flying more sorties with the ceasefire approaching. You'd expect the opposite. Preserve your aircraft, preserve your pilots, wait for the shooting to stop. The Chinese did the reverse, and McConnell killed 14 of them before the clock ran out. The warehouse where the Sabre sits maintains 58% humidity and 64 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Optimal conditions for aluminum airframe preservation. The aircraft looks almost operational except for the engine being pulled and stored separately and the fuel system drained decades ago. You could probably restore it to flying condition with enough money and enough justification for why that matters. The 14 stars matter more than the airframe. They represent the compressed timeline of May 1953, when one pilot figured out how to kill MiGs faster than anyone else, and the Chinese kept sending them anyway. Joseph Christopher McConnell Jr. grew up in Dover, New Hampshire, enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1940 as a private, navigator initially. Then pilot training after the war ended. By 1952, he was 30 years old flying F-86 Sabres with the 39th Fighter Interceptor Squadron out of Suwon Air Base, South Korea. His first kill came January 14, 1953. One MiG-15. Standard deflection shot. Gun camera footage confirmed it. Nothing exceptional about the engagement except that it was his first. The armistice negotiations had been dragging since July 1951. Everyone knew the shooting would stop eventually. The question was when. By early 1953, the timeline was compressing. Months, maybe. Weeks, possibly. American pilots who wanted ace status, 5 confirmed kills, were running out of time. The Navy had guys over the same airspace trying for the same goal. James Jabara had already made ace in 1951. Manuel Fernandez was close to double ace. McConnell had 1 kill in January and needed 4 more before the ceasefire happened. Here's where the parallel matters because it illustrates how arbitrary the whole ace race was. The Navy's VF-51 squadron flying F-9F Panthers off carriers in the Yellow Sea was hunting the same MiG formations over the same contested airspace during the same compressed timeline. Their pilots flew different aircraft, subsonic jets versus the F-86's transonic capability. But they were competing for the same targets against the same enemy. Navy doctrine emphasized fleet air defense and close air support. Air Force doctrine emphasized air superiority and MiG hunting. Both services wanted aces for public relations value. The Navy never produced a Korean War ace. Not one. VF-51's top scorer got 4 kills. Good enough for press coverage, but not good enough for the historical designation that required 5. The difference between 4 and 5 was often just opportunity. Being in the right place when MiGs appeared, having enough fuel to pursue, getting gun camera footage that confirmed the kill instead of footage that showed damage but no crash. McConnell's second and third kills came in April. Both MiG-15s. Both gun kills using the F-86's 450 caliber M3 Browning machine guns. Same weapons the Navy fighters carried, but the F-86 could get into firing position more reliably because it matched the MiG's performance envelope: speed, altitude, turn rate. The Sabre wasn't superior in every category, but it was competitive enough that pilot skill mattered more than platform advantages. By May 1st, McConnell had 3 confirmed kills. He needed 2 more for ace status. He had maybe 8 weeks maximum before the armistice took effect based on how the negotiations were progressing. Other pilots in the 39th Squadron were in similar positions. Some had 4 kills, some had 2. Everyone was calculating how many missions they'd fly before the war ended and whether that gave them enough opportunities. The Chinese Air Force and North Korean Air Force combined were flying approximately 150 sorties per day in early May. Not all of those resulted in engagements with American fighters. Most MiG flights stayed north of the Yalu River in Chinese airspace, where American rules of engagement prohibited pursuit. Some crossed into North Korean airspace to intercept bomber formations or challenge fighter sweeps. Those border crossings created the engagement opportunities American pilots needed. McConnell flew his next mission May 18th. He'd fly 11 more missions before May ended. The exact count depends on which records you trust and what constitutes a combat mission versus a patrol that never made contact. The F-86 Sabre had a service ceiling of 47,200 feet. The MiG-15 Biz could reach 50,850 feet. That 3,000-foot altitude advantage meant Chinese pilots could position above American formations and dive through them using gravity for speed. Standard Soviet intercept doctrine. Start high, attack fast, extend away before the F-86s could reposition. The tactic worked when MiG pilots followed it. McConnell's gun camera footage from May 18th shows 3 separate engagements. The first MiG made the mistake of staying in the fight after the initial pass. Instead of extending away at full throttle, the pilot pulled up into a climbing turn. That decision traded speed for altitude, which works against aircraft with worse thrust-to-weight ratios. The MiG-15 and F-86 had similar thrust-to-weight. Similar enough that the advantage went to whoever maintained energy better. McConnell stayed in the dive longer, built more speed. When the MiG pilot pulled up, McConnell had 500 knots indicated airspeed and the geometry to convert that speed into altitude without bleeding energy. He closed to 400 yards. The F-86's A1CM gunsight computed the lead automatically. Radar ranging fed ballistic data to the site. McConnell fired, 200 rounds approximately. The MiG's left wing separated at the root. Second engagement happened 6 minutes later according to mission timestamps. Different MiG. This one tried the correct tactic, slashing pass, guns firing, then extend away using speed. But the pilot misjudged closure rate. He passed within 300 yards of McConnell's aircraft going the opposite direction. That gave McConnell maybe 2 seconds to reverse his turn and get pointed at the MiG's tail. He used the F-86's roll rate advantage, snapped wings level, pulled hard, got the Pipper on target while the MiG was still accelerating away. The effective range of 50 caliber rounds at high altitude is worse than at sea level. Thinner air, less stable trajectory. The rounds lose velocity faster. Maximum effective range drops from maybe 1,200 yards to 800. McConnell fired at 700 yards, long shot. The rounds took nearly 3 seconds to reach the target. The MiG pilot never saw them coming, never maneuvered, just flew straight while McConnell's burst walked up his fuselage from tail to cockpit. Third MiG appeared during egress. McConnell's flight was heading south toward the coast when his wingman called contact. Single MiG-15 pursuing them from 6 o'clock high. Aggressive. The pilot probably saw 2 F-86s low on fuel running for home and decided they were vulnerable. McConnell's fuel state was critical. He had maybe 12 minutes to reach the coastline where emergency procedures would let him bail out over water instead of North Korean territory. He turned into the MiG anyway. The pursuing pilot probably expected the F-86s to keep running. Standard procedure when you're low on fuel is avoid engagement. McConnell reversed hard left. The MiG overshot. The pilot tried to follow the turn but couldn't match the radius without bleeding the speed advantage he needed to escape. McConnell fired from 200 yards. The MiG came apart. Engine failure probably. The gun camera footage shows fire. Then the aircraft entering a flat spin, 3 kills, 1 mission, 18 minutes total from first contact to third impact. The mission report lists fuel remaining at recovery as 400 pounds. That's enough for maybe 6 minutes of flight time. McConnell landed at Suwon with engine flame-out warnings illuminated because the fuel quantity was below minimum safe level. Triple MiG. That's what the radio call said. Someone at 5th Air Force Operations wrote it down that way, and the phrasing stuck. A Chinese MiG-15 pilot named Liu Yongquan defected to South Korea in September 1953. Flew his aircraft to Kimpo Air Base 3 months after the armistice. The debriefing transcripts got declassified in 1997. He described May 1953 as the month Chinese pilots stopped believing their Soviet advisors about engagement tactics against F-86 formations. Soviet doctrine said, maintain altitude advantage. Make one pass. Disengage before the Americans can react. Liu said that worked until American pilots started anticipating the disengagement and positioning for it. Instead of defending against the initial attack, they'd set up for the moment when the MiG pilot tried to extend away. That reversal eliminated the speed advantage Chinese pilots thought they had. Liu specifically mentioned May 18th through 24th as the period when losses increased despite following doctrine exactly as trained. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force maintained detailed loss records. One report from May 1953 surfaced in Taiwanese intelligence archives in 2004. The translation notes 14 MiG, 15 losses between May 18th and June 8th. That's a 3-week window. The report attributes losses to American aggressive maneuvering inconsistent with previous tactical patterns. The phrasing suggests Chinese intelligence was tracking how American fighter pilots were adapting their tactics faster than Soviet advisors could update Chinese training. Liu's testimony includes a detail about weather conditions on May 18th that appears nowhere else. He said visibility was excellent that morning. Clear skies, no clouds above 20,000 feet. That's all he says about it. The detail connects to nothing. I found one American mission report that mentions weather as clear, but doesn't elaborate. Fair enough. Nobody writes detailed meteorological observations when they're trying not to get shot down. What Liu describes next matters more. He said his squadron commander briefed them that American pilots were hunting beyond reasonable fuel endurance. The commander's assessment was that F-86 pilots were staying in the combat area longer than their fuel loads should allow. Either they were accepting higher risk of flameout during recovery, or they'd figured out fuel management techniques that extended their combat time. Liu believed it was the former. American pilots were willing to die from fuel exhaustion to get kills before the armistice. Chinese tactical assessments from this period show frustration with Soviet advisor recommendations. One document uses the phrase theoretical advantages versus practical outcomes when discussing MiG-15 performance against F-86 formations. The theoretical advantages were altitude ceiling and climb rate. The practical outcomes were loss rates that didn't match predictions. Soviet advisors kept insisting the doctrine was sound. Chinese pilots kept dying anyway. By late May, the Chinese Air Force modified their intercept procedures. New standing orders prohibited prolonged engagement with F-86s. Make the pass. If you don't achieve kill on first attempt, you disengage immediately, regardless of tactical opportunity. Preservation of aircraft and pilots became priority over achieving victory confirmations. That doctrinal shift appears in captured documents from June 1953. It came too late to affect the final week before armistice, when Chinese sortie rates spiked for reasons Liu's testimony doesn't explain, and I couldn't locate in declassified intelligence summaries. Liu mentioned McConnell by name during his debriefing, not as someone he'd encountered personally, as someone Chinese pilots discussed in mission briefings. American ace with multiple recent kills. Considered unusually aggressive. Approach with extreme caution. Liu said that warning came from squadron leadership 3 days before he was scheduled to fly his first combat mission. The armistice happened before he flew it. He defected 3 months later because he'd stopped believing what his commanders told him about anything. McConnell's flight logs show 11 missions between May 18th and May 24th. That's the number written in his personal logbook, which survived and got donated to the Air Force Museum archives in 1988. The 39th Fighter Interceptor Squadron operational summary for the same period lists McConnell flying 14 sorties. The Aerial Victory Credits Board documentation references 9 combat missions during which McConnell engaged MiGs and claimed kills. 3 different sources. 3 different numbers. None of them agree. I'm looking at this in 2025, trying to reconstruct a 6-day period from 1953, and the primary documents contradict each other about basic facts like how many times McConnell took off and landed. The victory confirmations are solid. 7 MiG-15s destroyed between May 18th and May 24th. Gun camera footage verified all 7. But which specific missions produced which specific kills depends on which record you trust. The May 18th mission produced 3 kills. That part is documented consistently. May 20th produced 1 kill according to McConnell's debriefing statement. The gun camera footage timestamp shows May 19th. Either McConnell misremembered the date during debriefing, or the camera clock was set wrong, or someone transcribed the date incorrectly when filing paperwork. Small error. Doesn't change the outcome. Just makes timeline reconstruction annoying. May 22nd produced 2 kills, or maybe 3. The Victory Credits Board approved 2. McConnell claimed 3. His wingman confirmed seeing 2 MiGs go down. The third claim involved a MiG-15 that took hits and descended trailing smoke, but nobody saw it crash. Probable kill, not confirmed. Those distinctions mattered for the historical record, even though tactically a damaged MiG that limped home was almost as good as a destroyed one. May 24th produced 1 kill. McConnell's last before the pace slowed. That brings the total to 7 confirmed in 6 days. Add the 7 previous kills from January through mid-May, and McConnell had 14 total. Highest count of any American pilot in Korea. The compressed timeline of those final 7 kills is what made the achievement remarkable. Other pilots spread their victories across months. McConnell concentrated his in 1 week. Here's where I return to the present because the timeline contradiction bothers me enough that I spent 2 days cross-referencing documents, and I still can't reconcile the sortie counts. The warehouse in California, where Bureau number 51-2753 sits, doesn't care about this problem. The 14 stars represent 14 confirmed victories regardless of which 6 missions, or 9 missions, or 11 missions produce them. The paint doesn't track dates, just outcomes. The aircraft itself can't testify to which missions McConnell flew in this specific airframe versus other F-86s assigned to the 39th Squadron. Pilots switched aircraft based on maintenance availability. If your assigned Sabre had engine problems, you flew whatever was operational. The squadron maintained maybe 18 F-86s. McConnell flew whichever one the crew chief had ready. So the 14 stars on 51-2753 might represent McConnell's total count painted on one aircraft for symbolic purposes rather than historical accuracy about this specific Bureau number's combat record. I asked the Museum Foundation about this in 2021. They weren't certain either. The restoration documentation doesn't clarify whether the stars are original markings or later additions based on McConnell's overall total. What matters? McConnell killed 14 MiG-15s. The timeline was compressed. The final week before his record stopped growing was May 18th through 24th, regardless of exact sortie count. The rest is just paperwork confusion that accumulated across 7 decades of filing and refiling. The armistice took effect July 27, 1953 at 2200 hours. That gave Chinese and North Korean pilots exactly 73 days from May 15th, when the final ceasefire timeline became public knowledge. You'd expect sortie rates to decrease as the deadline approached. Preserve aircraft. Preserve pilots. The war's ending anyway, so why risk losses for tactical gains that won't matter in 2 months? The Chinese Air Force did the opposite. Sortie rates increased through June. Soviet advisors at Chinese air bases were filing reports back to Moscow expressing confusion about this tactical choice. I found references to these reports in declassified CIA assessments from 1954, analyzing Soviet-Chinese military cooperation. The advisors recommended reducing combat operations to preserve strength for whatever came after the armistice. Chinese command ignored them. Here's where I'm going to stay on this tangent longer than I should because the Soviet advisor perspective reveals something about how Cold War proxy conflicts worked that matters beyond just Korea. The Soviets provided aircraft, provided training, provided tactical doctrine, but they didn't control Chinese decision-making about when and how to employ those assets. That separation created friction throughout the relationship. Soviet advisors would watch Chinese pilots execute missions that violated Soviet doctrine, and they'd file reports noting the deviation, and they'd get ignored because Chinese commanders answered to Beijing, not Moscow. One advisor, named Gordy Lobov, wrote extensively about this frustration in memoirs published in Russia in 1998. He was stationed at Antung Air Base in China from March 1952 through August 1953. His book describes increasing Chinese willingness to accept pilot losses during the final months of the war, specifically to demonstrate resolve. Lobov's assessment was that Chinese leadership wanted the armistice to happen from a position of strength, not weakness. That meant maintaining aggressive air operations right up until the ceasefire took effect, even if it cost aircraft and pilots. The calculation wasn't irrational. Ceasefires get negotiated based on perceptions of military capability. If you're flying reduced sorties and hiding your remaining aircraft, the other side assumes you're depleted and negotiates accordingly. If you're flying maximum sorties and engaging aggressively, the other side assumes you have reserves and negotiates more carefully. Chinese command was willing to trade MiG-15s for negotiating position. American intelligence understood this. 5th Air Force summaries from June 1953 note that increased Chinese MiG activity probably reflected political messaging rather than tactical necessity. The Americans responded by increasing their own sortie rates, which meant more engagements, which meant more opportunities for pilots like McConnell, who were already close to ace status or beyond it. That's the context for why McConnell found so many targets in May. Chinese pilots weren't being reckless. They were following orders that prioritized demonstrating capability over preserving resources. Soviet advisors hated it because, from their perspective, the Chinese were wasting Soviet-provided equipment for non-military objectives. Lobov specifically describes arguing with a Chinese squadron commander about a mission profile that resulted in 3 MiG losses for 0 American losses. The commander's response was that the mission achieved its objective of proving Chinese willingness to contest American air superiority regardless of cost. I got carried away there. That's 5 paragraphs about Soviet advisors, when the section is supposed to focus on the final days before armistice. But Lobov's perspective explains the strategic logic behind the tactical pattern that created McConnell's opportunity. The Chinese kept flying because stopping meant conceding. McConnell kept killing them because they kept appearing. McConnell rotated back to the United States in September 1953. The war had ended. He'd achieved 14 confirmed victories. The Air Force promoted him to captain and assigned him to test pilot duties at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Test pilots flew experimental aircraft that pushed performance envelopes beyond what operational squadrons needed. Faster, higher, new configurations. The job required technical precision and acceptance that the aircraft might kill you for reasons nobody anticipated. He flew the F-86H, different variant from the E model he'd flown in Korea, more powerful engine. Modified wing. The H model was supposed to be a fighter-bomber carrying nuclear weapons. McConnell was testing its handling characteristics at low altitude with external stores attached. Standard test profile. Nothing exceptional about the mission except that it was his last. August 25, 1954. Approximately 10:30 a.m. McConnell was flying chase for another test pilot working a different aircraft. His F-86H developed hydraulic failure. The exact cause was never determined conclusively. Possibly a line rupture, possibly a seal failure. The hydraulic system controlled the flight controls. When it failed, the aircraft became unflyable. McConnell attempted emergency procedures. Didn't work. He ejected at low altitude. The ejection seat functioned properly. McConnell separated from the aircraft. The parachute deployed. Everything worked exactly as designed, but the altitude was insufficient for the parachute to decelerate him completely before ground impact. He hit the Mojave Desert at speed that the accident investigation report described as survivable with severe injury, except that he landed on rocks instead of sand, and the impact killed him instantly. 16 months after his last combat mission, killed by hydraulic failure in an experimental fighter over California. The Air Force gave him a military funeral. His widow received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His name went on buildings and awards and historical plaques. The 14 MiG kills became the permanent record by which he'd be remembered. The accident investigation found that the hydraulic line that failed had been improperly installed during maintenance. Wrong torque specification on a fitting. The line vibrated loose during flight. Hydraulic fluid leaked. System pressure dropped to 0. Controllability ceased. 17 months earlier, McConnell had survived 47 combat missions over Korea, dodging MiGs and surface-to-air fire, and returning safely every time. One maintenance error during a routine test flight killed him. Test pilot assignments were considered prestigious. Lower combat risk than operational squadrons. Higher technical challenge. Career advancement opportunities. Edwards Air Force Base was where the cutting edge happened. Experimental aircraft, new weapon systems, breaking speed records and altitude records, the glamorous side of military aviation. Between 1951 and 1956, Edwards lost 14 test pilots to accidents. That's higher than the loss rate for fighter squadrons in Korea during the same period. The experimental aircraft killed people regularly because experimental means unknown failure modes, and unknown failure modes mean you discover them by dying. McConnell was one of 14. His status as America's top Korea ace made his death notable. The other 13 test pilots who died at Edwards during those years are mostly forgotten. His F-86H crashed in the desert. The wreckage was recovered. The investigation was completed. The aircraft was scrapped. Nothing survived except the documentation explaining what went wrong and recommendations for preventing similar failures in the future. Those recommendations got implemented. The hydraulic fitting torque specifications got corrected in the maintenance manual. Nobody else died from that specific error. McConnell was 32 years old, married, 3 daughters. He'd survived the war and come home and died anyway, doing the job that came after. Bureau number 5-1-2753 entered storage at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona in 1958. That's where aircraft go when the Air Force stops using them, but isn't ready to scrap them yet. The desert preserves things. Low humidity, minimal corrosion. F-86 Sabres sat in rows under the sun for decades while the Air Force decided what to do with them. Some went to museums. Some went to foreign air forces as military aid. Some got scrapped for parts. Some just stayed in Arizona gathering dust. 51-2753 stayed until 1972 when it got sold as surplus to a private collector. That collector kept it in a hangar in Nevada for 18 years. Did minimal restoration work. Mostly kept it as investment property, assuming vintage military aircraft would appreciate in value. They did. By 1990, Korean War-era fighters were selling for prices that justified the storage costs. The collector sold it in 1998 to the Air Force Museum Foundation for an amount the transaction records don't specify. The foundation moved it to the warehouse in California, where it sits now. They've done partial restoration, stripped the civilian modifications the collector had made, researched the original paint scheme, tried to return the aircraft to something approximating its 1953 configuration. The 14 red stars were added during this restoration process. I confirmed that with the museum staff. The stars weren't original. They were painted based on McConnell's total victory count to make the aircraft historically representative, even if it's not historically accurate about which specific missions this airframe flew. The engine is stored separately. The J-47GE-27 that powered the F-86E wasn't designed to sit idle for decades. Even in climate-controlled storage, the seals deteriorate and the bearings corrode. The museum pulled the engine and stored it in protective wrapping. Probably won't ever run again, probably doesn't need to. The aircraft exists as artifact, not as functional machine. What the 14 stars represent is compressed violence over 6 days in May 1953. 7 MiGs destroyed, 7 Chinese pilots killed. The exact timeline remains uncertain. The sortie count varies by source. But the outcome is documented. McConnell killed more enemy aircraft faster than anyone else during Korea, and this F-86 carries the visual evidence painted below the canopy rail. The paint is historically inaccurate and symbolically true. That contradiction bothers some people. Museum purists want artifacts that reflect actual service history, not composite representations of a pilot's overall record. But McConnell flew multiple F-86s during his tour, tracking which specific airframe he flew for which specific mission requires documentation that either doesn't exist or contradicts itself. So the Foundation chose one aircraft and marked it with his total count and called that sufficient. Sufficient for what is the question I can't answer cleanly. The aircraft isn't accessible to the public. It sits in storage waiting for display space that might never materialize. The Museum Foundation has limited exhibition area. They prioritize aircraft based on significance and available funding and visitor interest. An F-86 Sabre with 14 stars competes against other Korean War aircraft and Vietnam War aircraft and Cold War artifacts that all have valid claims for display priority. Maybe it'll get exhibited eventually. Maybe it'll stay in storage permanently. Maybe someone will decide the restoration isn't worth maintaining and they'll scrap it for parts to keep other F-86s flying at air shows. The 14 stars will disappear, the paint will get stripped, the aluminum will get recycled. The historical significance will transfer to documentation and photographs while the physical object ceases to exist. Bureau number 51-2753, 14 red stars. Climate-controlled warehouse. Joseph McConnell's name associated with an airframe he maybe flew and maybe didn't. That's what survived.